Morena Tauranga, Moana, good morning to everyone in this wonderful place we call home. Welcome to the Council workshop meeting of the 6th of November 2025. In terms of health and safety, if the alarm sounds, please make your way to the nearest emergency exit and we'll assemble down on Devonport Road towards the Strand. Please be aware this meeting is being live streamed and is publicly available on YouTube. Please could we speak clearly into our mics and turn your mics off, which I'm very good at. We'll have a timer, so if we could just limit our conversations to 5 minutes. Please turn off your mobile phones and we will hand to Councillor Rolleston for opening karakia. Thank you.
Tēnā koe mahai, kia noi tātou. Tui ki runga, tui ki raro, tui ki roto, tui ki waho, karongo te ao, karongo te pō, haumi e, hui e, ki e.
We don't need to do apologies, do we, for a workshop, so we're all good with that. So I'm going to hand over to Ben Corbett and Andrew Mead, and we'll go through. We're talking DCs today and giving some direction as to coming back with the policy.
All right, we'll kick into it. So we've just got some slides to work through, some natural kind of points where we can break for discussion, but if you've got a burning question, do just jump in. So we're just going to work through the kind of process and time frame for the DC policy review, the latest updates on the central government reforms and what that means or might mean for our policy review. I'll work through those first two bits, and then Ben will take over working through the proposed policy changes that we have as staff for the upcoming review, and then dealing at the end with a range of issues that various elected members have raised in terms of the DC policy. And we can have a discussion about that and what we might be doing around those issues moving forward. So just jumping on to the next slide, just quickly around the time frame. So the DC policy doesn't really exist in isolation. It's really driven by the long-term plan and, of course, the annual plan. So the annual plan preparation, the DC policy preparation sort of go hand in hand. The DC policy sort of follows the annual plan, so as you make changes to the annual plan, you add CapEx, you remove CapEx, you increase budgets, you reduce budgets, that affects the DCs. So it's really a mathematical exercise that occurs, the DC calculations. So in terms of timeframes, we're in sort of, we're in Q4 now of 2025, so we're thinking about the changes we need to make to the policy, which becomes operative on 1 July next year. We're moving into that phase where the CapEx program is being considered and key changes are proposed, and that will enable us to give you a first indication of any key changes to DC charges that we see upcoming, what's driving those. Not quite there yet, but that's upcoming in the next month or so. And then as we move into the first quarter of next year, that's when we'll prepare the draft DC policy for consultation, and we'll have a better indication around DC charges and any changes to those. So then we move through that process of consultation, deliberations, decisions, and adopt a final DC policy in June 2026 for that becomes operative on 1 July that year. And so I guess we are operating and reviewing our DC policy in the landscape where there's going to be, or there's proposed significant changes. So the move from development contributions to development levies, which are sort of similar but different, and still a little bit uncertain what exactly they look like. But they are to replace development contributions entirely. It looks like they're going to be a more simplified approach, so much larger catchments, possibly similar to our citywide catchment, and therefore you're going to end up with more or less one or two charges across the whole city rather than having it broken down based on the various costs of delivering infrastructure in different parts of the city, reflecting some parts of the city are very high, some parts are much lower. So you're not going to have that, and you're going to have some cross subsidisation within that development community by the looks. There's going to be quite from what we understand, quite a lot of a mandatory kind of process, methodology, calculations. So we'll sort of have to follow that. We don't know the detail of that at this point in time. So a lot of the choices we might have at the moment around how we calculate DCs might not be there under the new system. Overall, it's a bit uncertain what this is going to mean in terms of the whole mantra of growth pays for growth and trying to achieve that. We're hopeful that it's going to move us a step forward to growth paying more of the full cost of growth and there being less impact on ratepayers, but there's a lot to work through there. We've been providing input through a number of forums at a staff level, and the government has now recently been engaging with the development community. We understand that the legislation will be introduced before Christmas this year. Sort of been advised of that in the last sort of week or so that they're on track for that. And then that will be moving towards implementation. Well, so we move through a select committee process where we can raise issues, submissions. They'll finalise the legislation next year. And then it moves into implementation, so adopting a new development levy policy to replace our DC policy either from 1 July 27 or 1 July 28, just depending on how quickly they want to move and how much of the detail sits behind the legislation. So there's that quite significant change to consider, and then we've also got the water reform impacts, and we're obviously on that process at the moment, working through the due diligence, as I understand, to establish a water service entity, probably from 1 July 27, I think, unless I'm wrong. And the thing with the water service entity is that it will be responsible for collecting its own growth charges. And that will probably be under the same new development levy system, but the responsibility for, let's say, Three Waters, if Three Waters transfers, that will transfer over to the new water entity. They will be responsible for their own development levy policy and their own choices around how that looks under the new system. I think what's really significant about that is that, particularly with our citywide DC charges, nearly 90% of that charge is made up of water and wastewater. So, and there's been quite that debate about, when we charge that citywide contribution, building consent, subdivision consent. So that's likely to change significantly in terms of both the responsibility for those charges, but also, as we mentioned before, it's likely to be some mandatory requirements about when that's charged. So I guess, that's a just important component if we're considering making changes to that now, that's going to change again in the foreseeable future. Probably for the first year or two, there will be an arrangement where TCC probably collects those contributions on behalf of the water service entity. That's how it's looking to operate in the Waikato, where they're a little bit ahead of us. But even over there, the actual responsibility will transfer to that organisation entirely, and they'll run their own system, probably after about the first 2 years. So just moving on to that next slide.
So just on that transition, so where growth supposedly is paying for growth, there'll be some growth that's been paid for, that there's some infrastructure paid for that hasn't yet had the development hasn't yet happened. How will that happen with the water entity? How will we reconcile what the growth that we've paid for that hasn't yet been reimbursed by or paid for by DCs? How will we transfer that to the water services entity?
Christine will.
So through the planning for the waters entity, we're going to identify debt that needs to transfer the water entity, and that will include growth funded debt. So that's all part of the due diligence and planning stages. So the likelihood is that they would transfer across. The question is if where there is debt that's not going to be able to be collected because growth's not going to occur, then we need to figure out what we're going to do with that. So that's all going to come to you for decision making as part of the transfer agreements and planning for the water organisation.
But that's possibly quite a significant number.
It will be, yes.
And are we going to get an interim, this is the sort of risk that the TCC, excluding the water entity, is likely to have to pick up as a, what are we calling that, a unfunded growth that would normally be funded by waters, but it's not going to transfer over because it's not going to happen, but somebody still has to carry the can? I'm just thinking, what are we sitting there with 10 million at the moment on our balance sheet that growth is not going to pay for, or is that 40 million?
So I think what you're asking for is, so how we regularly, I can't remember what it is, 3 yearly or annually, I think it's 3 yearly, we go through and look at the likelihood of receiving the growth funded debt, and if it's not, we transparently move it from growth funded debt to rate funded debt.
Yeah.
So, and there's an approved methodology that has been signed off by multiple councils previously, elected and commissions that supported that process. So we would do that same exercise, and then anything that is still expected to be collected from this point onward would still transfer across. If then at some future point some of that isn't able to be realised from growth, that will be an issue that the water services entity needs to deal with, and it would need to cover it as part of its total management of its total debt.
And understand that, but we've never been in a situation where we're separating. If waters, the payments we're having to make up front to pay for waters, for growth, if you're saying that's quite a significant part of our DCs, then if we end up with 1 year we've suddenly got 30 million extra that TCC needs to cover because its growth's not going to pay for it, it's not going to transfer to waters because we were expecting it to be water paid for growth. We've never had a situation where we've got a cut off and we're going to make a decision and we've then got a number. So I just think we need to have a bit more feel for what that number is right now and not wait till be told about it at some stage and then just have to deal with it. What's the number? So, okay, my question, what's the number on our balance sheet at the moment that is unfunded infrastructure to do with waters that we are thinking might not be paid for growth in the future?
So Fraser's online from finance, I'm not sure if he has that number or not, but I think the key point is whether it's likely to be able to be collected through DCs or development levies or not, all the debt, all the water's debt will transfer to the new water service entity. So there won't be an issue where TCC remains with a significant liability.
Okay, so it will all transfer it whether it can be collected or not. That's not going to be our problem, it's going to be the water entity problem.
Correct, Chris. Yeah.
We would do the normal sort of reconciliation at a particular point in time and yes, everything would then go. So,
but even if you'll know that the waters entity won't be able to collect it from growth, you still will push it into there and make them worry about it and not leave it here and make us worry about it. That's what I'm thinking about. Who's going to be accountable when that decision is made?
I'm just thinking, normally we do that, Fraser's online, I can't remember, I think we do it each LTP process. So, and I think we transfer it, I'm not sure we transfer it at the year before the LTP or in the first year of the LTP, so that's probably a question for Fraser. But that will continue to happen every cycle, so anything beyond the transfer of assets and liabilities will all be owned under the responsibility of the waters entity. But Fraser will probably be able to talk about the frequency. I can't remember
Fraser's
the
got
date.
his hand up, so shall we turn to Fraser?
Yep, my apologies for not being there in person. Yes, so it is something that we reevaluate every 3 years. Currently, we are writing off at about $4 million a year. So that actual right, although we only rework and re-establish that amount, we actually do an annual transfer from DC funded debt to rates funded debt. The understanding I have in terms of what's happening is that all of the debt, whether it is collectible or not, will transfer to the new entity, and they will have mechanisms to be able to recover that, whether that is through their growth processing or just their normal charging, whether they would recover that. The expectation at this stage is that it would all transfer, but that is something that council, as part of their due diligence and work through there, can make a decision in terms of when they're looking at what debt transfers to the new entity. So that will be the elected members' decision.
And I would just like to make a note that I don't want that to be, I'd like some pre-warning as to what quantum we're talking about that we're having to make a decision on a bit sooner than just it comes in a paper, please.
Yep. So it is very approximate number off the top of my head is about $40 million, but I could not tell you how much of that was off the top of my head was relating to waters.
Yeah, so it's a big number and we don't suddenly want to have to
Yep.
deal with that just in
Yep.
time.
We can give you that breakdown.
I could possibly add, because I just received this from finance, that to give an idea of proportions, 309 million at 30th of June this year, 309 million growth debt, plus 37 million growth debt that has been transferred to ratepayers, another 36 million growth debt likely to be transferred to ratepayers, and 7 million growth debt expected to be collected as a targeted rate. So it sort of gives that proportion, and then we previously got the proportion of waters versus non-waters. So waters growth debt was 311 million.
Out of the
24, that was 2024.
Sorry, no, this is post waters with funding assumptions made in a table, but the FY25 was 311 million waters growth debt and 14 million, I've rounded the numbers, 14 million non-waters growth debt. So that includes some of the stuff that has to be transferred from there. But it gives you an idea that the vast majority of growth debt is waters.
Thank you. Sorry, we're only about 10% through the material and we're nearly 50% through our time, so we'll try and keep things moving. I guess the summary position, given all this reform, is that we're in a wee bit of a holding pattern around our DC policy. We don't see, or we see very limited value in making any significant sort of policy changes. Obviously updating the numbers and the charges makes sense, but there's not going to be any longevity to any changes we make to our DC policy at this point in time. There's a high risk that if we make changes, they're not going to be consistent with the new system, and we're going to have to rework them anyway. And then we've got the water service entity and the fact that they may take a different approach or philosophy around growth funding to what we might consider to be appropriate. So we do have a break there for discussion, but I think we've probably had most of that discussion. So I'll just turn it over to Ben, who will just summarise where we're at in terms of the small amount of changes we think we should make to next year's policy.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, and I suppose the key thing to say is we're going to come back to you on the 18th of November with a council report that puts all of this in down on paper and kind of nice and transparently, both for you but also for the development community to have that kind of record in place of what's coming for next year. And so if we do run out of time, there'll be a bit more detail in there. Through our City Future reporting, we've highlighted a number of changes that we'll make next year. It is a bit buried in an appendix, but it's there. So I just want to talk through each of those points, and we've got some other slides to follow on, and then we can sort of take a question. Apologise, it's a bit of a lolly scramble of ideas on DCs, but we'll get through it. So we had signalled that we wanted to look more substantively at how we go about allocating growth funding for transport and active reserves. We've recently done, over the last few years, quite a close look at how we fund waters and community infrastructure. Those processes for transport and active reserves probably don't make sense in light of the growth funding reform, because we're probably going to be mandated about how we do that in future. So it's a big job to review each of those, costly in terms of staff time. So what we're thinking is that we'll leave those for now. We don't think that there's going to be a high opportunity cost to leaving it. Obviously, we're always looking to lawfully maximise our DC revenue. Active reserves is unlikely to see any new introductions just because of the nature of the CapEx spend through the LTP being quite distant and uncertain. But for transport, the only project we've identified to date that we think we could possibly start charging for is the Connecting the People turret to Welcome Bay, or 15th Ave to Welcome Bay project. So we'll use our current methodology to assess that project and look to introduce it to the policy if appropriate. And so we'll see that in February.
So just on that, like, probably the best time to introduce a new project like 15th Ave to your DC charges once you've got confidence that the project will move to construction and the NZTA will co-fund. So it's probably tied up with that future process, which is not too far away. And just quickly on the active reserves, there is a report, as I understand, on Paruithi, Parra Farms upcoming. And possibly a further report on the Eastern Corridor active reserves, and so whatever decisions are made through those will obviously be reflected back through the policy.
The next point is on timing. So we've discussed that a couple of times with you already. This is the question of, do we charge all our DCs or the earliest possible chance, which tends to be subdivision, or do we carry on with our current approach of charging a local charge on subdivision generally and the citywide on building consent? Again, it probably doesn't, we sort of have had this as an action to come back and discuss with you. Again, in light of the growth funding reform, it's very likely that we'll be mandated to charge at the earliest opportunity, so on subdivision. With that change coming either way, there's going to be quite a substantial lead-in period for us to change from our current approach to the new approach, and there'll probably be a mandated transition regime as well. So it doesn't make a lot of sense for us to develop our own transition regime, start it in 2026, have it scrapped in 2027 and start a new one. It'll be confusing for me, it'll be confusing for developers, and probably not the best use of time. Third point here is on some of the recent decisions that have come through chambers for MPAC and QEYC. MPAC decisions have been, which was to keep Otomoto Pool open, were reflected in the current policy. You've still got some decisions to come to you around the MPAC, the future facility, the sort of concept that comes through, the budget, the timing. All of those three factors will impact the DC charge. They can each be quite material. I'd say that probably the biggest one is just the amount of pool space, because that contributes to the level of service benchmark. But we'll feed into that reporting as well, so you kind of get that visibility as it comes through, but signalling that that could have an impact. At the moment, we're using the last approved, adopted budgets and timing. Obviously, there's been a lot of reporting and discussion on that so far, so it's likely there'll be a change. Timing will probably be sort of add potentially a fly in the ointment. So if decisions were made sort of by the end of February next year, then we would be able to report that through into our draft DCP, we'd be able to consult on it, whatever comes through, that would be fine. If the decisions are made after that time, then we're a little bit more hamstrung in terms of what we've consulted on. We can always go down, which is probably more the direction you're trending in, but from what I've picked up in terms of budget, but the impact on how much pool space you're providing will then be part of the discussion as well. So we're sort of hamstrung in terms of the total amount of DC funding you can apply to that project post-consultation for 26-27, and also we're kind of pinned in for an amount per household. We can change it, we can increase a little bit, but you're sort of looking at overall maybe sort of a 5-ish%, 5, 6, 7%, single-digit changes ideally, just in order to kind of pin us back to that, what we consulted on, and people having a fair chance to give their views on it. So that is on the overall DC charge. So you've got quite a bit of buffer there because the waters obviously offsets the change, but just want that to be sort of in your minds going into that process. We're also looking at another change around indoor courts. So with QEYC staying open for 15 more years, that's pretty much permanently from a DC perspective. It changes how we think about growth in our network. Currently, we're collecting for the Bay Park Arena extension. We only collect for one project at a time. So, rerunning the numbers, what's probably going to happen, keeping QEYC in the existing network means that Haumaru, the Cameron Road facility, does now actually provide some growth capacity. We would look to then remove Bay Park from the DC policy next year, add in Haumaru, and charge for that. The money that we have received for Bay Park can be reallocated to Haumaru, so it's not lost, it doesn't need to be refunded, anything like that. We've done an early calc on the numbers, and it seems to be very, very minimal, the difference that it makes on the actual charge. I can't remember if it's up or down, but it's about $2.70, so minimal. So we'll look to progress that next year as well. The sort of thing to signal there is I know there's ongoing conversations about our level of service for indoor courts in the city, and a substantial, depends on how you frame it, but if we say fewer people per court or more courts for the population, that will then probably, depending on how big the change is, probably use up the growth capacity that we've identified at Haumaru and put us back into charging for Bay Park. So, yeah, it's fun.
I sort of, when I looked through the policy previously, I didn't think it limited us to one at a time. I'm still struggling to understand when we've got a sort of a unofficial strategy to have eastern and western facilities, like on both sides of the city, why we can't charge DCs for both, and whether that needs to be a localised DC or a citywide.
There's probably a few points there. Obviously, the ones that are nearer are far more certain, and it's always good to have certainty when you're taking DCs for something that you're actually going to spend it. But I guess the second point is if you start building in too many facilities that you're taking DCs for, your planning period, like the period it provides for growth, will become very, 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 very long, like 30, 40, 50 years. And then you start overlaying, the impacts of cost of capital on that, because, you're spending the money generally sooner than you're receiving it. It can seriously increase the DC charge. So you're right, there's no statutory reason why we can't consider that, and if we were building two facilities very close to each other from a time perspective, we probably would do that, but there are other reasons that we're not doing
But I think what you haven't addressed is the reality. The reality is we've actually built or fitted out Haumaru, so it's really there, and the fact that it will take Bay Park to a 49-year time frame, to me that's reality. And surely if we can get DCs for Haumaru, which to me is logical because the demand is coming from growth, then if we've got the ability to do that, we're basically trading off ratepayers paying now versus a longer time frame with capital, interest on the capital, aren't we?
So it won't affect the total amount of DCs that you're collecting. It's just about which facility they're being collected for. So it won't really impact that spread of cost between the ratepayer and the development community.
All right, so these are a series of more minor changes that we're looking to make to the policy, and the reason we're sort of progressing with these, even though they'll probably become redundant in a year or two, is that they make a big difference to our DC assessor team in terms of the efficacy of the policy. So point 1 and 3 on this list, secondary dwelling update and DCs for granny flats, are quite closely related. So at the moment in residential zones, if you build what you probably think of as a granny flat, either standalone or attached to your house or whatever, but something that's 1 bedroom, a living area, a bathroom, maybe a kitchenette, that type of thing, DCs apply to that dwelling, and they'll be local and citywide DCs, depending on where you are. There's been a bit of confusion in the development community because we had our Plan Change 33, our MDRS plan change, come through, which removed the definition of a secondary independent dwelling unit, meaning that those sort of granny flats now pay citywides and locals. And we've also had the sort of granny flat legislation come through from the government, which has had a lot of a lot of talk around how much cheaper and faster it's going to be and things, and we're a bit concerned that people might think that they then don't need to pay DCs, and that's how it's cheaper. Our understanding of it is that it makes the consenting fees a bit cheaper, and it makes the timeline for consents, or the timeline to build quicker, which makes it cheaper. But DCs are still payable, and so we just want to add some wording in on both of those points to be crystal clear about the DC application to those builds. The second point is on bedrooms. We have a definition of bedroom, and that's important because our citywide DC, which is pretty expensive, is charged based on how many bedrooms you have, and so there's a high incentive for people to have as few bedrooms as possible. Whether that means relabelling a bedroom a lounge or whatever, there's all sorts of things people might try and do to say they have 2 bedrooms to just 3 or whatever the case may be. So that means our bedroom definition gets a lot of focus on it from the development community. We updated our bedroom definition this year to sort of improve it, but as is the way with these things, sort of by improving one thing, we sort of seem to have made it worse in another way. And so what we're planning to do is go back to basics and sort of restart the definition instead of trying to incrementally improve it. Fundamentally, our approach isn't changing. Basically, every room is a bedroom unless it has a defined other purpose: kitchen, bathroom, hallway, laundry, garage, anything else counts. So that's what we currently do, but by hopefully making it more simpler, easier to understand, it'll make our lives easier particularly for the assessor team.
So just on that, would we not just be better to go to a house size? Because I get the bedroom thing, it's sort of, but it doesn't necessarily actually equate to, if you've got a 100 square metre house with 3 bedrooms, it's going to be hard to live with 6 people in there. Whereas if you've got a 300 square metre house with 2 bedrooms, you potentially could fit a lot more people in that house, which is, I'm guessing that the bedroom is trying to get the use of services versus the house. I don't know. Is that normal that we do bedrooms? It seems very. We just been in Auckland and they're selling 1 bedroom with 1 plus flexi because they don't meet the definition of a bedroom because they don't have an outlook and things like that. But they, in all intents and purposes, can be used as a bedroom. So it's not, that's not even, it's officially it's not a bedroom because it doesn't have an outlook, which is the rules in Auckland.
So you could take either approach. Both have pros and cons. The bedroom approach is well established and sort of backed by census data to kind of say, well, if you have more bedrooms, you tend to have more residents, and more residents or occupants, and more occupants tends to mean more demand for services.
You have a problem. My mother, she's got 3 bedrooms, but she lives by herself. So, it doesn't.
Yeah, that'll still be the same for space.
So DCs is very much an averaging approach. You look at generally for a 3-bedroom house or a 4-bedroom house, how many people live in it, how much demand does it create. DCs are not perfect. They're not a case-by-case assessment of actual demand. The bedroom approach is, it's got good data, and it's the approach that most councils use. I'm not sure I've seen any council using the size of a dwelling. And that again, that'll be considered as part of the methodology for the new development levy system about what approach they use. We're not sure how that will look at this time. Just quickly, I might just close this bit down so we can move on to the questions.
Just a real quick one on the granny flat issue. Since the service is already on the section and we're just adding effectively a slightly oversized bedroom, are we, instead of charging a 1-bedroom DC, do we just charge the difference between a 3-bedroom house and a large house to keep the cost down? Because the infrastructure is already there. If the section's got a toilet and a bathroom and all you're doing is adding a second toilet bathroom, effectively you're making a large house on the same section.
So those granny flats can be up to 70 square metres. They could have a couple of bedrooms. They might, potentially have, 2 people living in each room. You could have 3 or 4 people living in them. We treat them as a separate household unit. on the basis that while there are services there, you know, they're turning the tap on, taking water out of our water treatment plant, they're flushing their toilet, it's going through the wastewater treatment plant. So, yeah, the fact that there's existing services doesn't mean they're not creating additional demand and cumulatively additional investment requirement for the city. Yeah, but obviously if there is a 1-bedroom house, it'll be charged the 1-bedroom DC charge. If it's 2-bedroom, so they do get the lower charge. That does apply. Yeah. Just quickly on those other things, we're just making some refinements around the new catchments that we added last year. So there's just a variety of just little tidy ups and improvements there. And in terms of population projections, we're just continually, you know, make sure we're working from the best data. What you'll see coming through the upcoming quarterly report to the City Futures Committee is a quite substantial revision of long-term population projections by Stats New Zealand for the city and for the sub-region, which are much, much higher than what we've been working to in the past and what Stats New Zealand have projected in the past. So we're not looking to implement those changes at this point. That needs quite a lot of discussion and consideration about, I guess, the achievability of those and the allocation of those between the two different councils. So that would be separate.
What is the timing for that discussion?
So that's coming to the next City Futures meeting, not for decision making, but just for information at this point. You'll have to make decisions as part of putting together your LTP around what population projections you use. We'll also be mandated which population projections we have to provide for through our spatial planning and the new RM system and delivery of development capacity. So we've got an indication of what that is, but that's yet to be confirmed. So there'll be a range of different points and possibly different population projections you use for different purposes.
All right. So now we're into the section where we've had a few questions, a bunch sent through by the Mayor, but this one is from Councillor Crowther at the recent City Future Committee. For context, Claudia Halberg was presenting on the Waters project pipeline, and she mentioned a project in Cherrywood, which is a stormwater project designed to alleviate existing flooding and provide for growth. And there was a question about, will we look at growth funding some of that investment? Short answer, just because of time, is that no, we won't. The real challenge for stormwater is applying the LGA to that process. We have to look at cause and benefit. While growth might be, or sort of preparing for growth might be causing the investment in this particular piece of infrastructure, we also have to consider elements of renewal and improvements to existing level of service to alleviate that flooding. While there might be a growth balance there to provide for growth in the future, it's really difficult to charge for stormwater catchments because they don't reflect our DC catchments. They're often much, much smaller and benefiting a very small spatial area. So that means you end up with a lot of administrative complexity in terms of applying that to a really small group of properties. And then also it can become quite uneconomic because it can be quite an expensive investment spread over a very small number of developments. Potentially that might not happen ever, so it could just sit there, you know, when you're thinking about a really small brownfield development area. Happy to take any questions on that though.
Will that apply to Gate Par then as well?
Yeah, so like with Te Papa, there's about 25 different stormwater catchments, and we're probably going to invest in maybe 2 or 3 of those over the 10-year period and so there's about 25 different stormwater catchments in Te Papa, as an example, including Gate Par. And we're going to only invest in a couple of those as TCC over the 10-year period. So if you were to take DCs, you would have to create a catchment for each of those, which would be very small. There'd be a very limited amount of development in those, and as Ben says, the DC charge would be very high. Probably better to look at you know, either, if you don't like general rates, a more targeted rating mechanism, because there's benefits to properties whether you develop or not, if you're removing flooding and flooding risk from many different perspectives in terms of the property value, in terms of, you know, from insurance purposes, yeah, and just general enjoyment of your property. So the stormwater one's really hard. In greenfield environments, it's easy because you've got to create a stormwater system for a whole new area. In brownfield areas, it's very, very fragmented.
I guess I'd just comment that, number one, we have to be very careful saying that we're supporting growth, paying for growth on that basis, because, as you'd know, the projection is that some of the biggest costs to New Zealand councils, well, water entities now, will be depending on who does it, will be stormwater in future, and a lot of that will be localised. And if you look at the adaptation projections and things like, we're probably better off than some cities, but you know, it's a very significant issue. And if we sort of start off not going down growth pace for growth, we have to be very careful about how we use that slogan, because this is a key piece of that.
I guess the kind of key point is there is flooding risk already. So from that level of service perspective, or looking at backlog, there's a huge component of that in any stormwater investment. Yeah. All right.
The other good news is that with funding reform, that approach is likely to change and make it a lot easier to fund the growth share. So the water service entity will probably be able to take a different approach, and probably so will TCC if we still had it in time. DC charging for residential intensification. There was a question from the Mayor to understand how we go about charging DCs, and it's the same as everywhere else. So you subdivide your back section, or you build 50 apartments on Cameron Road, you pay local and you pay citywides. That's no different to building in Wairaki or anywhere else. And we also have a couple examples here. So this is the Vantage building on
Sorry, Ben, I just think the key thing is that the intensification is normally much cheaper from a DC perspective, because it's located generally in our infill areas where the DC charges are much lower than in your greenfield areas. So I guess that's just a key point.
Sorry, can I just ask, Mount's zero?
Unbelievable. Zero. Yeah. So there is a Mount catchment, and the assets in it have all the growth funding for them has been completed. They were fully repaid. That doesn't mean that it'll always be that way, but that's sort of the natural cycle of DCs that you work through. You repay it all, and then it ends. So a couple of examples. This is the Vantage building. The ground, I don't know if you've been in there, several floors of residential and then a ground floor of commercial. And this is an example of the DCs that were charged. So left-hand side is what was actually charged, and right-hand side is what would be charged if they lodged their consent today. Massive difference there. And you can see why, and you'll see on the next slides a similar example for the Craigs building. The key drivers of that are, well, there's many, but the big ones are the Waiare water treatment plant wasn't being charged for when this was lodged. That's a significant cost. But there's also a large number of increases for community infrastructure, which are flowing through to the residential component of this charge, as well as that as in this environment, as you know, we've seen higher interest rates and things that kind of all have an impact too. For D's. Yeah, and I think that's right, and that you can't just look at the cost, but you've got to think about those apartments are selling for 1.6 mil or something. So it's exactly. So I don't think this money, the sort of, even though it is an extra $1 million, it's a lot of money, but in the scheme of development that probably cost over $50 million easily, you know, it's important to kind of have that context.
So just the other thing, Ben, just if you go back to that, obviously those citywide increases have been felt for all development anywhere in the city, any type of development. But the other key change there around the local DCs was the introduction of the Te Papa catchment following the completion of the Te Papa spatial plan and the investment that was included in the last 10-year plan for Te Papa. So that was, you know, trying to reflect that growth pace for growth approach.
So we're anticipating that on the right is what it would cost the city today to the additional cost it would have to service those apartments. Is that right?
That would be
we're pretty much saying we're charging costs.
Yeah.
So are we on our growth pays for growth, saying that the $1 million, which you said wasn't a whole lot versus 50 million for the development, but that just falls to the rest of Tauranga to pay for.
If the developer wasn't paying for that million, then
Yep.
general ratepayers would
Yep.
be paying for that million. Yep.
It's just important that, we
Yes.
say it's
Yeah.
not a whole lot that goes on to developer, but it didn't.
Go on
So
the
we need to
community,
say,
yep.
well, that's pushing our rates up.
Yep, exactly right. Similar example here, this is the Craig's building down the bottom of Devonport Road. Again, an extra $1 million on there. This is not, we decided to go apples with apples, so this was actually consented the year after, slightly different amounts, but just to give you a sense of the scale. But same story here, big increase that would have otherwise sat with ratepayers. No residential here, so not such an impact in the local space, but still a big increase.
Pretty much all everything that council charges apart from, consenting fees and stuff. So that's
That's right.
there's not another bit of at resource consent or.
No,
No,
correct.
that's-
Yeah. So this is covering off both the sort of the resource consent and the building consent
Yeah.
charges. Yeah. City centre development incentives is a massive topic that really should stand on its own. But we have had some questions about it, and we just want to signal that this work is underway. We considered city centre development incentives in 2023 as part of long-term plan consultation. To be honest, it's a pretty nuanced and complex conversation. So while we did get sort of 500 submissions on it, half of those weren't actually related to the idea of city centre incentives. So it's probably one where we'll need to show some leadership there. And they were, of the people who did support on it, half in favour, half against. What we are sort of proposing is that we'll bring some reporting back to you early next year, looking at what are your objectives for the city, what do we want to achieve, what are some strategies to achieve that, and then what tools could we use to implement those strategies, and perhaps DCs as part of that picture. I know you've had a meeting earlier this week. It's with Emily McLean talking about the funds that already exist and how those can be used. So that'll all look to be sort of wrapped up. But I think if we go straight to DCs, you risk the tail wagging the dog a bit, and you might end up spending money somewhere that, in hindsight, you would rather have allocated it elsewhere. We have looked at what other councils have done. The Mayor asked us to look at Christchurch. Christchurch has recently implemented an incentive in August this year, which is very recent, so they haven't had any applications under it. They've made $2 million available as an absolute number to be used over 2 years, and it's to fund DCs for buildings of 6 stories or greater. It was inspired by Hamilton, I would imagine. We've got a slide on Hamilton here as well. Hamilton's been running a scheme in various different forms for about 15 years, but most recently they implemented one in 2021, which is similar to Christchurch's. It is a bit more tiered, and it brings in some design outcomes as well, not just the height of the building. They've made 3 grants since 21-22, and that's totaled about $1.8 million in general rates funding to meet that shortfall. So that's probably the one to use. They've just got a bit more kind of water under the bridge. We asked them for some feedback on how it's going. It was mixed. Obviously the headline is it shows that council's supporting development, which is great. But the actual effectiveness is kind of questionable, in that they weren't confident that these developments wouldn't have happened anyway. DCs, as we've just talked about, are a substantial number, but within the context of the whole development, not necessarily make or break money. But they did think that if a developer was kind of considering projects on an even footing, if they were otherwise the same, they might build in the city centre instead of on the fringes. Would you build a 6-story building on the fringes? Don't know. But, so something to consider. So we'll feed into that reporting coming back to you next year if you're keen to receive it.
Sorry, just probably for clarity, it's not necessarily a incentive. More, is our policy fit for purpose when you're considering city centre development? And I think what I can see from that, it's not, in the fact that we charge the same citywide DCs for a 40 you know, a 40 square metre apartment with 2 bedrooms as we do for a as an apartment, as a standalone house out in Papamoa, which is 200 square metres with 2 bedrooms. So I don't think that's fit for purpose to encourage you know, the apartments to go up, which actually drain a massive amount of less resource because, you know, we're not having to build a 10-kilometre pipe to do our wastewater. We're not having to provide public transport, you know, as much. We're not having to provide a whole lot of, I guess, facilities for that inner city apartment that we are for the houses. So it's not necessarily an incentive. It's just saying, are we taking into account, you know, the relatives cost of these different developments, and, you know, is there a way that we can continue to encourage those things that maybe don't take the you know, the actual resource that's you know, that greenfield development does. And yeah, I guess there is an incentive there, but it's more just balancing, you know, what is the actual cost, and you know, we're actually getting back more the actual cost than, yeah.
So just to respond, I accept your point, and we can look at that further. That's probably reflected in the fact that the local DCs are much lower in, say, the city centre than they are in greenfield areas. But if you look at the citywide DC charge and the services that we provide there and the location of those, like the Tamanga treatment plant, the Waiari water supply, they are very distant from the CBD, and therefore the CBD does create a significant cost growth in the CBD because it needs to be serviced by that distant infrastructure with very long pipes, very expensive treatment plants and that sort of thing. So that's probably the difference between those two charges.
We made it.
Done. Oh, look at that. Nailed it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Yeah, interesting. So I look forward to hearing back around that. But yeah, I think just going back to that city centre, we'd just like to make sure that it is purpose built, that there is you know, some sort of mechanism that we are encouraging that density in the CBD. So thank you. We'll keep the meeting open and roll on to our next